Nuclear Doctrine, Part 1. Here you can see a row of British nuclear Vulcan bombers. The history of U.S. nuclear thought began almost immediately after the American dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate opened up between Bernard Brodie, who was a naval historian who wrote the book The Absolute Weapon in 1946, and William Borden, who wrote a book There Will Be No Time, also in 1946, who worked within policy circles in Washington, D.C. Borden argued that nuclear weapons are simply bigger artillery. He's remembered by military specialists for his technically accurate predictions on missile developments. War is possible as long as leaders may come to believe that surprise is possible and inevitable between two great powers such as the US and the Soviet Union. War will involve simultaneous, rapid rocket attacks across great distances, but eventually technology would be developed to permit rockets and energy beams to shoot down other rockets. Surveillance and launch would be mostly automatic. Here you can see a US air-launched cruise missile. Key targets will be military, not cities, as precious nuclear resources will be used to destroy countervailing forces, or counterforce. In other words, targeting military assets. And cities will be left as hostages to the victor. The civilians will surrender when they lose the ability to fight. Why waste high-speed weapons against slow-moving targets like cities when slow attack systems such as bombers can deal with them later? Destroying New York City would not bring victory. City busting occurs after the battle is won. Industry does not matter because the speed of nuclear war relies on initial stockpiles and not ongoing production. Therefore, there should be no evacuation or dispersal of people from cities. The goal of nuclear war is to provoke the enemy to exhaust their own nuclear weapons on fortifications. Land armies would only be required in the unlikely outcome that the stalemate occurred, but this is unlikely. Missiles would be placed on dispersed submarines and ships, which would reduce the success of a first strike, and missiles would eventually replace bombers. Nuclear war is a tactical artillery exercise, and there is therefore no upper limit to the number of nuclear weapons required. Brodie argued that nuclear weapons represented a fundamental change in international relations and war. He is strongly supported by academic proponents. He rejected the arguments of Borden. War is irrational because nuclear war will cause greater damage than any possible political gain except as a weapon of last resort against conquest. Nuclear weapons are strategic weapons, and they have transformed warfare because there is no defense against them, and therefore the destructions of one's cities are guaranteed. The focus therefore becomes one of avoiding the outbreak of war. Nuclear superiority is therefore non-existent. Nuclear weapons are difficult to locate, and therefore surprise does not matter. Retaliation also does not have to be guaranteed, just likely, in order to be deterrent. Sudden surprise attacks without prior indications of tensions also do not exist. Here you can see a US Skybolt missile, probably being loaded on the B-52, also in the picture. The military approach to nuclear weapons. The Bordenesque and the Lanchester equations argue that you achieve a bombardment concentration of force by using surprise and the initiative to defeat the enemy with nuclear weapons. Problems encountered included coordinating the sequential launch of missiles against an enemy to maximize the amount of enemy forces surprised, to maximize the likelihood of hitting a target, to maximize the multi-directional aspect of an attack to overcome defenses, and to minimize fratricide of your own weapons at the same location at the same time. So the Pentagon used a computer program called SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, to plan all of the various scenarios, and these were reduced to a number of simple options for the executive decision maker, the President of the United States. The US military has seen nuclear weapons as primarily military weapons, and nuclear war was to be fought quickly and decisively against an enemy state. Soviet nuclear doctrine. This military influence was pervasive in the Soviet Union. There too, nuclear forces were not seen as decisive city busters, but as weapons designed to augment the ability of ground forces to engage in conquest. Soviet views on nuclear strategy were twofold, but both rejected the Western academic assumption that nuclear weapons made war irrelevant because of the high cost of the consequences of their use. While both camps in the Soviet Union believed that nuclear weapons were principally war-fighting weapons, they differed over the necessity of a supporting land force. Conservatives, exemplified by the Army and the Navy, believed that conventional forces were necessary to exploit the opportunities created by nuclear bombardment. The radicals, typically in the SRF, the Strategic Rocket Forces, and the Air Defense Forces, the PVO, believed that war could be won by nuclear bombardment alone. The losses the US deemed unacceptable and too costly for any political gain was believed to be measurable by the Soviet leadership. The Soviet Union had lost some 26 million of its population during the Second World War, and was therefore both experienced with the effects of high losses and material devastation. It had lost 60% of its industry. Russia was also experienced in the process of fighting in the face of such losses. Consequently, the Soviets viewed defeat rather than war itself as the principal problem, because of the way they faced genocide from Nazi Germany, and have therefore pursued weapons development irrespective of its effect on stability. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, sided with the radical school, as did Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader from 1963 on. This strategy remained largely unchanged even into the transition in Russia in the 1990s. The Soviet Union viewed nuclear weapons as being used initially and suddenly in conjunction with a multi-theater ground and air attack to capture land, particularly in Europe and China. Here you can see a US Atlas on a launch pad. So these are the different fronts that the Soviet Union saw itself expanding in, with ground forces supported by a massive strategic strike followed by tactical nuclear strikes. For the Soviet Union, it was about capturing land, because people live on land, and once you control land, you control industry. And that is actually a political goal worth achieving, even if it involves a nuclear exchange, because once you control land and you're strong enough, you will never let go. So you can see the three major fronts for the USSR. There's Western Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and secondary fronts in Latin America, Africa, Vietnam, and the Mediterranean. Here's a depiction of a Soviet advance from Poland and East Germany through the NATO countries. The picture is of a Polaris sea-launched ballistic missile launch. Now, some neutral areas would be under pressure, like India, Pakistan. It was believed that nuclear weapons at sea would be used much more early than weapons on land. So it's possible escalation could have started with the oceans. So let us take a look at an approach that contradicts the Lanchester and the Borden approach to nuclear war. Thomas Schelling has produced a number of analyses of how to use nuclear weapons in bargaining. He is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who applied that logic to nuclear strategy. So Thomas Schelling argues that the civilian approach to fighting nuclear war is to fight slowly. So he formulates the problem into, how do you fight and win a nuclear war? And really the first question from this is, how are nuclear weapons different? The first answer is, nuclear weapons can be fired quickly. But this is not inevitable, and in fact, it's not important. Here in the picture you can see a Chinese J-8 aircraft being moved into a bunker next to an airfield. The second answer Schelling offers to the question of how are nuclear weapons different is because of technology, for the first time in a long time, we can get around someone's military to hurt them directly. In ancient times, this was common to hurt people. More recently, you needed denial. In other words, you needed to defeat the enemy's army, and then you could access their population to hurt them. Here you can see a picture of a Soviet SS-8 Sasson ICBM. Now there's a quote from Schelling's book, Arms and Influence, page 19, quote, "Against defenseless people, there's not much that nuclear weapons can do that cannot also be done with an ice pick," close quote. So the logic here is that hurt and punishment is an alternative to force and denial. Nuclear weapons are designed to hurt. Because they can get around the enemy's military forces, victory is no longer a prerequisite for hurting the enemy. Another quote from Arms and Influence, page 13, quote, "Military victory was but the price of admission," close quote. "But now you didn't need to fight the military." So let's look at the problem. How do you win? Schelling redefined this as, well, how do nuclear wars actually end? Well, there's one alternative, alternative A, which is fight as quickly as possible and fire off all of the nuclear weapons. Another alternative, alternative B, is fight a limited war, slowly escalating as you go. Why would you want nuclear war to be slow? Well, Schelling argues because state A and B, they have a common interest, and that common interest is against annihilation. Schelling sees a nuclear war in which you have alternating, limited nuclear exchanges. Here you have a Polaris sea-launched ballistic missile in launch. So the goal is to keep the war from becoming purely destructive. Why? Because if you allow a war to become completely destructive, there is no objective. Wars should not end by exhaustion. Why? Because you want to minimize your losses. Do you want to destroy your enemy? Schelling says no. Well, why not? Because the enemy must have something to lose. If you destroy them, they'll have nothing to lose, and they'll be unrestrained. In nuclear war, you use threats and promises, but you do not kill the hostage. You do not destroy the enemy's cities. Also, you do not decapitate the enemy's political leadership. Why? Because you need an opponent's leadership to bargain with. Here you can see a British Polaris ballistic missile submarine, the HMS Revenge. So there are two basic threats. One, you can kill him, but this is ineffectual because he's simply going to kill you. Number two, you can risk continuing or expanding the war. So how do you win? Well, you win by convincing your opponent to settle on your political terms. How do you do that? Through tacit bargaining. That means bargaining without communication, through action, by signaling. If he hits a city, you hit a city back. And this shows resolve and not weakness or bellicosity. But your actions have to show connectedness. You have to link his action with your retaliation. Here you can see a US Titan ICBM launch. So how do you make the link? Well, tacit agreements are based on saliency of an issue. If you look here at the map, if you're going to meet, where would you go? Probably you'd meet at the bridge that crosses the river near the middle of the map. If you're going to divide up the territory, along what geographical feature would you divide it up along? Probably the river. So these are common sense solutions. So ultimately, the outcome is based on a division not of capability, because with nuclear weapons, you have an infinite capability. Rather, it's divided according to your relative interest. Therefore, credibility is important. And you're appealing to an underlying notion of justice. So when you divide the pie, intuitively, if it's two people, you would share it equally. But it means you also need to learn to deal with shared risk situations, especially when you both want to avoid annihilation. So you have to learn how to manipulate that risk. This may mean you have to risk rocking the boat to see who gives up first. Sometimes you'll need to show commitment. I will not give up. And the art of commitment consists of sometimes burning your bridges, which were done in ancient times, so that you couldn't retreat and you're committed. This could mean you'd be forced to play a game of chicken. You'd be forced to take the steering wheel and throw it out the window so that you would not have control. In a nuclear war, you may have to let your nukes go off automatically. You could use a tripwire, so that if the enemy approaches you, you're automatically caught in the conflict. Attack their commitment by using salami tactics, or the tactics of erosion. Undercut their deterrent by hitting below that threat. Use guerrillas, for example, against your opponent. Gradually, over time. This is an aspect of the stability-instability paradox. The opponent may have nuclear weapons, but then you can deploy conventional weapons against them. Attack his commitment by securing a fait accompli. Take control of territory and then make them make the effort to get it back. Defend against their salami tactics by a disproportionate response. Perhaps attack them multiple times. Of course, the problem is it may not be credible. Give the opponent the last clear chance to avoid a disaster. If you're playing a game of chicken, fix your steering wheel at the last second, or take it and throw it out the window. To avoid a collision, they're going to be compelled to turn away, not you. Make them provoke your automatic system. Create a threat that leaves something to chance. So make a threat whose outcome you're not entirely in control of. Give nuclear weapons to forces on the battlefield. If the enemy uses nukes, your soldiers may panic and also use them. Use the rationality of irrationality. Threaten to lose control or actually lose control in order to extract more from your opponent. He will give you more than your share of the pie as a cost of avoiding collective annihilation. An example is US President Nixon went on a simulated nuclear alert in October of 1969 to signal the Soviets his displeasure with North Vietnam. Ultimately, it didn't produce results. This was termed the madman strategy, and it involved General Earl Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sending a memo on October 19th to his commanders to initiate operations between 13 and 25th October designed to be discernible to the Soviets about U.S. strategic readiness. These included grounding aircraft for readiness checks, periods of radio silence, increased surveillance of Soviet ships, and increased readiness of ground troops, all designed for the Soviets to take it as an indication of a preparation for nuclear war by the U.S. This was reported in the 2003 Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In effect, using deterrence to deter war, then using deterrence within war to avert mutual annihilation. All of this is the art of brinkmanship, which is the deliberate creation of a recognizable risk of war, a risk that one does not completely control. It is a tactic of deliberately letting the situation get somewhat out of hand, just because its being out of hand may be intolerable to the other party, and force their accommodation.